We want to think it's a few rotten apples. We want to think it's psychopath, but it's actually good guys who do this. And this is where Giselle's book is extraordinary. The truth is both that he was a good dad and that he took incestuous pictures of his daughter, that he was a good husband and that he almost tortured me to death. I mean, for me as a moral philosopher, that's a fascinating question.
All of the women there looked at Giselle and thought, this could be me. Are enough men looking at the men and thinking, could this be me? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. The trial of Gisèle Pelicot shocked France and far beyond. It was a case so disturbing it forced a national reckoning at home, but raised questions everywhere about consent, complicity, and the terrifying ordinariness of the men accused. But as the world continues to confront the vast scale of abuse linked to billionaire financier Jeffrey Epstein, it raises a deeper question. Are these crimes the work of monsters, or do they reveal something far more deep-rooted about power, entitlement, and men? Joining me today is the French philosopher, Professor Manon Garcia, whose latest book, Living with Men, reflects on what she witnessed while observing the Pelicot trial and poses the question, how can women live with men now? Professor Garcia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, we want to believe, don't we, that the men who carry out terrible sexual crimes are in some way an aberration, a perversion. And we can look at a man who drugs his wife and then invites other men to come and rape her as a monster, a one-off. But it doesn't explain the scores of men who took up his invitation to come and rape his wife.
Yeah, so I think this is what I found very interesting with the Pelicot trial, is that usually the cases that get public attention are cases that are extraordinary, that are like the horrible case of Sarah Everard in the UK. So, you know, women walking at home and getting raped on the way. And so this corresponds to a fake horrible scenario of the unknown man in a parking lot, etc. But we know when we work on sexual violence that most of the times it happens in the family, at home, with people you know. And so with the Pelicot trial, with the Pelicot case, you have the extraordinary dimension of at least 70 men, something that really catches the attention of everyone that sounds horrible. We have a sort of voyeur desire to know more how horrible it is. And then what we see is the normalcy of sexual violence. We see a man that rapes his wife, that, you know, he loves her, but he also does horrible things to her. We see really complexity of patriarchy, complexity of human actions, complexity of responsibility, moral questions, which for me was, as a philosopher, was really fascinating.
I mean, you know, it's a particularly pertinent moment to be talking to you for a number of reasons. You know, the headlines are full of the Epstein case at the moment, and all the talk is about rich and powerful men and the way they abuse that wealth and that power that they have. These were not particularly rich men. These were ordinary men. These were lorry drivers, a nurse, a journalist, a soldier. And that messes with our head, doesn't it?
Yes, but it's so interesting because when it happened, people were saying, look, it's a class thing. They're lower middle class or working class men. They're from France, or they're from the south of France. So basically, the people in Germany or in the US or in the UK were telling me, oh, it's such a French case. The people in Paris were telling me it's a south of France case. The bourgeois were telling me it's a working class case. And now people are saying, oh, the Epstein scandal, it's an upper class case. And so in both cases, it's the same system of entitlement, of social structure, of men not like lacking accountability and thinking that women victims don't matter. And so it's there. So of course the Epstein files are particularly outrageous because it's men in power, but it's fundamentally the same idea of we don't get to pay for anything we do, we protect each other, exactly like these men in Manon protected each other, because some of them knew each other, actually. Some of them talked to their friends about what they had done. No one called the police. Even in the trial, there were 2 men who had come to the house of the Pelicot and who said, no, I'm not doing this. But And Gisèle Pelicot asked them during the trial, why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you send me an anonymous letter? Like, imagine, we've watched all these TV shows. They had just to cut a few letters from the newspapers and tell her, your husband is having you raped and drugged, But there is this sort of, we protect each other feeling that we see exactly the same way in the Epstein files. So it's not a matter of class.
So whether you're a lorry driver or Jeffrey Epstein, you are still able to rape a woman, and you are enabled by the people and by the men around you, and not just the men very often. What does that tell us?
So I think it tells us something about masculinity, not at all that all men are rapists or anything like that. I'm not interested in individual, in the case, in the Epstein files, I'm particularly interested in responsibility at the individual level. But I'm a philosopher. What interests me is the social structures that make that possible. How men are raised to think that women as singular human beings don't count, that they're a woman, that they're a body to which they can do things, not to whom, to which, because that's what you see in the videos, because I had to watch these videos, is that they're not seeing her as a who, they're seeing her, she says it herself, as a ragdoll, as trash. They just do things to her body as if she were not a human being. And so what is happening socially is that men are raised to think of women partly that way, that women's sexuality is not seen as an alter ego with whom you can do things, but rather a thing to whom you can do things.
But how does that come about? So as I say, you have Jeffrey Epstein, a billionaire, a financier, you have a soldier, say, or a journalist in Manon. The grooming trials that have rocked the UK are ordinary men, fathers, sons, brothers, who can do terrible things to women, girls, and are often in denial about, and are shocked to be held to account very often.
Yes, and that's something that really fascinated me on the day of the verdict, because for random reasons, I found myself in a room with the family members of the accused. And so, of course, you wouldn't be surprised to know that it was only women who had come. So the mothers, the daughters, the sisters, the wives who had come to see their husbands, fathers, sons be sent away to jail for rape. And there were broken, really, like, one fainted, one threw up, they were like yelling during the verdict, and you could see that it hadn't counted. It didn't count for these men. So it's not just that they destroyed Gisèle Pelicot, it's that they destroyed their own families. And all these women, like, even we're hearing about Melinda Gates being asked about the acts of Bill Gates. You see that the women's life don't count. And this is really something that fascinates me. What is happening in the culture so that men are raised to think that way?
And what is your best assessment of that? That is the biggest question, perhaps. How has this happened? Where has it come from?
So I think it comes from everywhere. I think it comes from the movies. I mean, you and I, we grew up with James Bond, We grew up seeing these women who are pushed into a wall and say, no, James, no. And then they say, oh, James, yeah. Like, it's this idea that the hunter-prey system is the way eroticism functions, that men will always have a woman at home who cares for them. This sort of myth of the prostitute and the mom, these two feminine figures, instead of thinking of women as another human being with whom you can do things. And I think it's really hard to disentangle this and to invite men to think differently than the boys' club. Because what we're seeing in Westminster, it's the boys' club. But what we're seeing in Maison is also the boys' club. It's just a different one.
But it's interesting, is that just about, you talk about the social structures, is that just about masculinity when it comes to sex and sexual desire, or is it something that actually permeates every aspect of life, work, home life?
I think it's a question of entitlement. It's entitlement to sex, it's entitlement to care, it's entitlement to housework, it's entitlement to,
to behave terribly without being held accountable.
No, but what I mean is that men feel entitled to women's attention, to women's sexual availability, to women's work for them. They think it's normal. And I think this is what we're seeing right now is the backlash, is that suddenly men are like, what? I'm going to have to clean the toilet as well? I'm going to have to pick my kids up from school? Like, I have better things to do. There's many men who would
say this is outrageous, that they help at home, that they're not rapists, that they're decent men.
Yes, of course. But, for instance, my husband is a wonderful man. So I'm in a situation of being a heterosexual woman, and I want to believe that some of the men out there are really good. But when he takes care of our kids, he gets high-fived in the streets all the time. Every time he takes our kids, I don't know, on a train, people are like, what a wonderful dad. Every time, people tell me all the time, oh, you're so lucky that he takes care of the kids when you're traveling. That's extraordinary. So, but people tell him that. So it makes even the most well-meaning people give us the feeling that this is extraordinary that he's treating me as an equal because he travels for work. No one tells me, oh, you're alone for 2 weeks. How, like, you're babysitting your kids. No one thinks that I'm babysitting my kids. So I think there's very many layers. So of course, not all men behave actively badly, but all men reap the benefits of the system of non-accountability for men.
The thing, when you said earlier that, it is not all men, and of course, that Me Too, that was the echo that came back, not all men. The thing about the Pelicot trial was, by the time you have understood that Pelicot puts out a message, and the men have to live really close because he can't risk the sedative wearing off. So
he wants them to come in less than 24 hours. So he plans it for the day, but he has this rule that it has to be, if he goes online in the morning, they have to come that day. And so that eliminates a lot of people, and they need to, he geolocalize them, but also they need to be available that very day. So it can't be something that is planned with time, etc. So to imagine that you can find 70 men in the blink of an eye that are ready to come the day off. I mean, recently, because I know I'm very curious about what happens in other countries, because I see people thinking, the French and sex, etc. But recently in Quebec, there was a journalist who put on an ad on a website, a bit like Coco that Pelicot used, saying, oh, my wife, I drug her and offer her, really describing the Pelicot case. Would you be interested to come? He said he had over 100 responses in 48 hours. It's in Quebec. In Germany, they found, some German journalist found a Telegram group of 70,000 men exchanging recipes of chemical submission and pictures of how they raped their significant others asleep. So it's not just these men in these towns. So first of all, not all men, but so
it's a lot
many
of men.
So many men. And so many of them.
And in that sense, you sat in the trial every day and listened to what excuses or what explanations the men gave. What were they saying?
So it was very complicated because you need to put yourself in their shoes, which is a bit, but they can't say anything. There are videos. I had to watch the videos. The videos leave no doubt, like you see that they did what they did, but you also see that every time she moves by 1 millimeter, they're ready to run away. So it shows that they know that it's absolutely forbidden. It is very clear that she's in a coma, really. And so there's no doubt. They can't believe that she's half asleep or that it's a scene setting, as some said. So they invented things like, he gave us her consent. So I thought it was very interesting because there's a very old history of women being the possession of men, right? And so there's this guy who said it was his house, his room, his bed, his wife. And I found it fascinating, this list, because it really showed that for him it was comparable, the bed and the wife, and that you own your wife the same way you own a bed. Yeah. But also, what else could they say? There was no possible line of defense. But what was interesting for me is that because there was no possible line of defense, you could think, and the French criminal law allows for it. If you recognize your crimes, if you show that you've thought about it, that basically if you're seen as much less dangerous because you've thought about what happened, you get much fewer years in prison. And in this case in particular, we don't show the video. They didn't show the videos for the men who recognized. So they had a lot of incentives to do a mea culpa, and still, they did not.
There are so many layers to this. So you talked earlier about how, Gisèle is seen, she's described like a rag doll, isn't she? Lying on this bed, she's snoring. She's an older woman, and she is seen as this thing. And at the same time, there is the men's entitlement, the sort of denial that they've done anything wrong. I mean, how have we got here? And what does it say more widely?
So there are two anecdotes about the trial that I found very telling. One is one of the judges asked the few, maybe 3 or 4 men that had erection problems on the videos. And he said, but what happened? But he was really incredulous. But he never asked any of the other men, why did you have an erection? Which was the question that I wanted to hear and the response that I wanted to hear. And it showed that there was, even inside the courthouse, a shared understanding of what was hot about the scenes. And that I found very troubling, because I really think this judge had no idea that it made him side with them in a certain way.
But he understood how the men were able to do it or were aroused.
Yeah, exactly.
He didn't understand the men who weren't.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the judge.
That is really bizarre. And then there's one of the accused who said that the next day after he raped Gisèle Pelicot, he talked to friends about it, and they said, dude, that's hardcore. You raped her. That's a rape. And he said, yeah, I realized I really had done a bad thing. But then, so a part of me was really relieved when that happened. I thought, okay, at least one that recognizes. But then I thought, A, none of these friends notified anyone. And B, the way he told the story, it sounded like what you would say when, I don't know, someone said, well, last night I drove too fast, or I took my parents' car and didn't tell them. But it was very clear that their day had kept going, etc. But, had he said, last night I killed someone, or last night I cut the leg of someone, the story would have been very different. So there is a question about, why are we so used to the idea that women get raped? What are we, and I think as women, this is something we have internalized. So I talk about this, it's very depressing, I agree, but this fact that we have internalized that we're rapeable, that we need to protect ourselves from this rapeability, but that this is always on the horizon. There's a very famous feminist philosopher called Susan Bryson who wrote a book about the aftermath of the rape she was a victim of. And she said, in the moment that she got raped, her first thought was, oh, that's it. That's the thing against which I was told to protect myself, to always be on the lookout, etc. That's happening. So it was as if women's lives are kind of oriented by the sexual violence that is permanently threatening them. But it's crazy, like imagine, I don't know, then I promise I'll stop with the anecdotes, but I really don't want to make an analogy. But in Germany, you have, and actually all through Europe, but in Germany you see it more, you have those little stones they put in front of the houses of Jews who were, and of people who were deported by the Nazis. And I find it a very powerful thing because it's a sort of decentralized memorial of Nazi violence. And it got me thinking, imagine what were happening if in just one street, we were materializing on the walls how many women have been raped in the street, how many times, like what it would look like. So I think as a society, we are in a sort of collective, constantly renewed amnesia of the size of sexual violence. And yeah.
And I mean, you also explore that Hannah Arendt's argument which was made about the Holocaust and the banality of evil, that, ordinary people can do terrible, terrible things. And that is exactly true here, isn't it?
Yes. So I think what I found very interesting with Arendt, so to be honest, the reason why I used Arendt in the first place is because, there are not a lot of women philosophers. And so I knew that as a woman philosopher who goes to a trial, everyone would be like, oh, you're doing the same as Arendt, even if it's two completely different trials. So I thought, okay, I'm going to show what I have in common with her, or which thoughts we can have in common. And I think what she is saying about the Eichmann trial is that Eichmann, first of all, can't say anything about what he did. And this was also very striking for me, that there was this sort of complete lack of introspection. These men, they can't say anything about who they are, what drives them. And that was terrifying because if they can't say anything, then you can't change them. It's as if they're stuck, they don't have access to their feelings. One of the things they said that I found very interesting is many of them said, well, it was a time where my wife or my partner was not having sex with me for X and Y reason. So I went to Gisèle Pelicot. And then you think, okay, so are the two fungible? Like, can you really replace the sex that you're having with your wife by raping a semi-dead body of a woman you don't know? So that was, for me, that was in a way, the most terrifying thing. If they really think that the two are exchangeable, what is it about male sexuality that is going on? Like, how can we live with men? And then the second point that Arendt makes that I find very useful is the question
about Eichmann's crimes and his relation to it during the Holocaust.
Yeah. So one thing that she says is that she says we need to look at the complicity of German society. Without German society, Eichmann doesn't exist. It's not an individual problem. And this is something that I'm trying to make very explicit in the book. The reason why there's something unsatisfying about the criminal trial is that there are individuals that are trialed, but it's very clear that the problem is systematic and social. It's a social problem of how we perceive women, how men feel that they don't have accountability, etc. And so the logic of the criminal law, which is punishing one responsible individual for one crime, is very limited in front of rape culture. I don't really like rape culture but in front of the whole system of gender hierarchy. And so I really feel like, okay, some people say, and I agree with this, like rapists should be sent to jail. Okay. But it's really trying to empty the ocean with a little spoon, like we're going to take one rapist by one rapist when we know that Dominique Pelicot can find 70 guys in the blink of an eye in in his own surroundings. How are we going to build prisons every week, more prisons and more prisons to put all the rapists there? Because, we talked about not all men. That's true. But I think you and I know that almost all women have at least one story of sexual violence. And so there's an arithmetic problem. It can't be the case that all women were violated and no men we know violated anyone. Because we have this feeling, and I mean, that's what you see in Gisèle Pelicot's book. She thinks she calls him a great chap, when she's first arrested. She says, Dominique, he's a great chap. So she thinks the love of her life is a wonderful guy, and her sons are wonderful guys, and she doesn't have doubts about his family, and I think we're all like that. We think the people around us are great, but there is an arithmetic problem. It can't be the case that all our friends got violated and none of our male friends violated.
But that business of, because it wasn't just Gizelle who in that first instance says, my husband is a good guy. Other partners said he can't have done this because he's a great dad, he's a good partner.
Yes, but...
And wider society, in a sense, as you say, the men didn't go away and phone the police.
Yes, but that's something... I mean, as a researcher on these issues, I know that rapists are guys next door. I know it. But then I arrived in the courthouse, and I talk about it in the book. I was waiting in line, and there were these guys that were kind of cutting the line, and I thought, well, it's not really the time to play your toxic masculinity that you cut the line.
To get into the public gallery, you thought?
Yeah, to enter the courthouse. And so I thought, who are these guys who are cutting the line? And then I realized it was actually the accused. So they didn't have to wait in line with the public because they were forced to be there. And so it was my first moment of, oh, wow, I'm very close to a rapist right now, even physically, And then a bit later, that first day, there was this guy that I saw several times in the corridor and where I thought, a bit amused, oh, he was so my type 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Like, as a teenager, I would have loved him as a guy. And then I saw him in the room. And I had really a very troubling experience because he's actually exactly the same age as me. He has a kid who's born, I think, 1 week away from my first kid. And as I said, I found him very sexy. And so I could see myself as his wife, as his victim, as his, suddenly I could occupy very different places around him. And I could see his wife. She thought, oh, he's very depressed and I'm helping him and he's such a good guy. But the problem is that we need to recognize that you can both be such a good guy and do this. And this is what we don't want to see. We want to think it's a few rotten apples. We want to think it's psychopath. We have really this impulse to psychologize it, but it's actually good guys who do this. And this is where Giselle's book is extraordinary, is that she could have said, well, I was a victim of a monster and I didn't see it coming. But the whole book is about how do I deal with the fact that there is no doubt that he was a good guy, that he was a good dad, that he was a good husband, that we really loved each other. And the truth is both that he was a good dad and that he took incestuous pictures of his daughter, that he was a good husband and that he almost tortured me to death. And how do we look? I mean, for me as a moral philosopher, that's a fascinating question. How does that work? But
it's a terrifying question for all of us, isn't it? And so you've been speaking to Gizelle very recently, and she has her book out. Finally, she can tell her side of the story. What do you think she achieved, given your sort of the inadequacies of the court system to tackle more broadly this issue of sexual violence against women? She was waiving her anonymity. She knew what she was doing because she knew people would sit up and pay attention. Maybe the voyeurism or something that you touch on. But what has she achieved in doing this, do you think? What
I don't think
she's
she
achieved?
imagined for 1 second that it would have that much impact. But I think what happened, so I told her, I don't want to talk in her place because I think she's less feminist than me or less radical in her feminism than me. But I do think that her book, you really see the trial as the birth of a feminist. That she arrived there really thinking, I don't want to pit men against women, etc. And then she went through 4 months at the end of which she was talking about patriarchy and toxic masculinity. And she had just experienced in her flesh how the system had patriarchal sides, how these men didn't feel sorry, how these lawyers were helping them not feel sorry, were enabling them in their crimes, etc. And I think it was really a consciousness raising exercise for her. But also, what is fascinating about what she did is that, you know, her husband, one thing that strikes me is that he only talks about her, even during the trial. He never calls her by her name. She is only my only love, my saint, my absolute love. So she's this abstract figure of perfection. And by the way, we know that there's this sort of trope of, I'm going to kill the woman for the love I have for her. This is a very old trope of men with women. And these 50 other men that were trialed, they just saw her as a body or a thing. And she claimed her name. She, you know, it used to be a trial. It used to be the Pelicot trial because of Dominique Pelicot. But now for everyone, it's the Gisèle Pelicot trial. She got a first name. Her last name became her last name, not his. And it's very interesting because in philosophy, so Simone de Beauvoir in the Second Sex talks about how women are seen in a sort of general way. They're always a woman, you know, like you have we see it on the news when we're told, oh, Peru has a female prime minister, or a woman got named at the head of the World Bank or something like that. So it's always a woman. And what Beauvoir says is we need to fight sexism by recognizing women are as singular human beings. And that's exactly what Gisèle managed to do. She became a singular human being that had a name, a last name, and a story, because this is what she does in her book. She tells the story of her life. She narrates herself as a full subject with a singular, specific history. And that is exactly the counter move of patriarchy, which is why, so this is how the shame changed sides, is that instead of being voiceless, she managed to have not only a voice, but her own voice.
What does it change? I mean, Beauvoir was writing decades ago. And so what does it change in the fight against violence against women, for example, if your book paints the bleakest of pictures about the men, not all men, who are willing and able to go and rape a comatose woman lying on a bed, and yet still be in denial, still be quite sort of cocky and sort of arrogant and in their not willing to be held accountable. So are we left with the idea that unless men want to stop raping women, it will never happen?
So, I mean, we can look at it the Giselle's way. You know, her book is an optimistic book. It's about joy. It's about renewed hope, etc. So it's from the inside the story of a possible reconstruction. So that in itself is a source of hope. I have the sad work of being the outsider that describes how it even happened, how it was made possible. But I think what I do in the book is that I'm not just writing a sort of abstract, objective philosophy book. I write a lot in the first person about what it does to me. And I think one of the things I experienced in this courthouse is the strongest feeling of women's solidarity I've ever felt in my life. And I'm an academic. Feminist academics talk a lot about, can we even say we the women? Is there even a we? Like, women's lives are very different. But Gisèle Pelicot, she received thousands of letters from everywhere in the world every day. So she really says she received letters that were addressed as Gisèle Pelicot, Avignon. It was just the address and it got to her. And, there was these Aboriginal women from Australia who came and gave her a scarf. She was recently in Brazil at the Corcovado, and women were crying, saying, "Oh, you're Gisèle Pelicot." We were in this room applauding her every morning and every night. And in this applause, there was something about, we're here with you. It could be us. Maybe it is some of us. And we're having this consciousness of, this needs to stop. And I think, this is the thing about chemical submission and about her case, that people think, I hear some people say, oh yeah, it's gotten really bad, sexual violence. I'm like, no, it's always be like that. It's just that finally we get to talk about it. The cases of chemical submission in the UK, like, who knows if we would have heard about it without the Pelicot trial. Right now, there are cases in Germany, in France, in the US, in the UK. Suddenly people acknowledge, they are husbands who drug their wives and their daughters to rape them. And there is also this strong feeling that it has to stop.
I mean, we're running out of time, but I do want just a couple more really quickly if I can. You talk about, all of the women there looked at Gisèle and thought, this could be me. Are enough men looking at the men and thinking, could this be me?
So the whole book, so that's why I call my book Living with Men, is that I wanted it to be like, guys, we need you, and I haven't heard you enough. We haven't heard you enough. And I don't want men to be shamed about their masculinity or anything like that, but I want them to look at themselves. The way we look at ourselves and at what could happen to us. I mean, it's way easier to identify with the victim than with the torturer. So I understand that there are men who say, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm a good person, I would never do this. But the question is, has it happened that you've left your best friend bring back a drunken girl from the pub? Have you turned a blind eye to sexist jokes? Have you let other women be made uncomfortable by things that happened, etc.? Like, the only way we're gonna change things is if men look at painful parts. And the problem is that just as much in the Epstein case as in this case, people say, oh, we didn't know. But the question is rather, we didn't want to know, is how comfortable it is to not look at the difficult sides, at the difficult tendencies. So I want to tell men, please look at it, even if it's really uncomfortable.
And when you've spoken to Gisèle and she says she is hopeful, she has optimism, I just wonder, do you?
I'm less optimistic than her, certainly, because also I think she is in her own story, but I remember that my first day in the courthouse was the day of the election of Donald Trump. And I used to live in the US, and I remember seeing all these reactions to this masculinist incel influencer, Nick Fuentes, who had tweeted, "Your body, my choice," And I was in this courtroom seeing the tweets, all these manosphere retweeting "Your body, my choice," and seeing all these videos about her body, their choice. It kind of contained my enthusiasm and my optimism about the future.
And just to be clear, your body, my choice is men claiming.
Yeah. So it's men that are reusing this feminist slogan of my body, my choice, in saying now that Trump is elected, you see, we're going to go back to the good old times of your body, my choice. And I think we need to be careful about optimism.
And just finally, everyone talks about it is about how we bring up our boys, mothers and fathers. Is it as simple as that?
I think it's partly as simple as that, but I don't want to think only my kids would get to see a better world. So it's not just the boys. We need to educate our husbands, our brothers, our friends, etc. It's a lifelong education, I think. But also one thing, maybe like a very practical aspect to conclude, is that now we've seen studies that show the best predictor of the gender views of children is not how much time their father spends with them, is how their father treats their mom and participates in the everyday life, etc. So all these guys who are absent are training their kids, educating their kids much more than the mothers that are home or taking care of the kids and juggling a job and childcare, etc. The men who are absent are educating just as much or even more than the women. And so it needs to be also a question about fathers. We need to educate the fathers so that they can educate the boys.
Professor Manon Garcia, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.
That is it from us right now. Until next time, goodbye.